Afternoon. We're glad to have you come to be with us for our fall Philosophic Forum. I think we've got a really interesting, evocative topic this semester. The topic is, where is God in all this mess? We have, and it will become obvious very soon where we're headed with that, and we hope that you enjoy it. And more than that, we hope that it brings up some insightful thought on your part. We're being joined today by live stream with several of our other colleges around the 16-college Kentucky Community College system, and we welcome them as well, those of you watching by live stream. So before we do anything else, I'm going to introduce our panel. We have on the far end Pastor Matthew Smith. He's has been and is the professor of sociology here at Big Sandy, and he's also senior pastor at Destination Community Church here in Prestonsburg. And he's been there for how many years now, Matt?
3.5.
3.5 years. He's got it down to the day and the hour. So. But we're glad to have Matt. We've used him before in this venue, and he always does a great job. We've also got Rob Musick with us today, and Dr. Rob is chaplain of UPike at Pikeville, and he's an ordained pastor who's transitioning into the Episcopal Church. His educational qualifications are that he earned his MA from Ashland Theological Seminary, and then his DMin from Methodist Theological Seminary in Ohio. Matt earned his undergraduate degree and master's degree from East Tennessee State University, and then he earned his Master of Divinity degree from United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio. Are you in DMin track now, Matt, or?
Soon to be when I can afford it.
Well, okay. Well, affording it is, sure, with the money they pay you here, be no problem. And then finally, last but not least, and I haven't had really an opportunity to meet him very much, and I met Rob Musick just a few moments ago. We've got Father Rob Adams. He's the guy with the collar, and he's currently serving as pastor of St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church in Pikeville, the pastor of St. George Catholic Church in Jenkins, and Father Adams holds a BA in philosophy from the University of St. Thomas. He holds a bachelor's in sacred theology from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, and a licentiate of liturgical sacred theology from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross of Rome. And if you don't think that's a mouthful to say, try to say that real quickly. But he's with us today, and he's come with us, and we're glad to be there. Let me just give you a brief definition of what theodicy is. And that's what we're talking about, theodicy. Theodicy has been the one single problem Christianity has never dealt with to any degree. It just, you just throw up your hands. And most people do. And most people eventually come back to something that just is a cheap way out of the question. Theodicy is a vindication of the knowledge and the goodness and the power of God. It seeks to answer the question of why a perfectly good God would permit such an inordinate amount of both natural and moral evil measured in suffering in the world. So when we talk about evil in philosophy, we're equating that with suffering. So we could say that either one of the words, evil or suffering. It's just bad things happening. So if we've got a God that's all good, all knowing, all perfect, then why do babies die? Why do innocent people get bombed? Why does a great number of things happen that we feel shouldn't happen if God is indeed in control? And so this has been a problem since day one in Christianity, and we're going to try to deal with that today. And I'm going to. I wanted to start with a constructive dilemma from philosophy, but I might just pass over that because it basically just states what I stated just then in a philosophical formulation, and there's really no use to do that after saying what I've just said. What I do want to start with is a reading from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. The two folks who are involved in this reading, and then I'm going to ask the panel a question, each one of them a simple question with a yes/no answer. But what's happening here is Ivan Karamazov and Alyosha Karamazov are brothers. Ivan is a deep-thinking skeptic, and he doesn't know if there's a God or not. He doesn't know why things happen as they do. Alyosha is a young novice in a monastery, and he's headed for a career in the church and in devotion and in doing the work of God. So Ivan is going to present Alyosha with the very question that we're talking about today. Then I'm going to ask our panel to comment with a yes or a no, and then I'm going to ask them perhaps to comment on their answer. Just a short scenario. Here's what Ivan says to Alyosha. Here's what he puts to his brother. There was a little girl of 5 who was hated by her father and mother. Most worthy and respectable people of good education, good breeding. You see, I must repeat again, it's a peculiar characteristic of many people, this love of torturing children, and children only. To all other types of humanity, these torturers behave mildly and benevolently, like cultivated and humane Europeans, but they're very fond of tormenting children. Even fond of children themselves in that sense. It's just a defenselessness that tempts the tormentor. Just the angelic confidence of the child who has no refuge, nowhere to go, no appeal, that sets his vile blood on fire. Every man, of course, has a demon lying within, the demon of rage, the demon of lustful heat. At the screams of the tortured victim, the demon of lawlessness let off the chain. The demon of disease that follow on vice, gout, kidney disease, and so on. This poor child of 5 was subjected to every possible torture by those cultivated parents. They beat her, thrashed her, kicked her, for no other reason till her body was one bruise. Then they went to the great refinements of cruelty to shut her up all night in the cold and frost in a privy because she didn't ask to be taken up at night, as though a child of 5 sleeping in angelic sound sleep could be trained to wake and ask. They smeared her face and filled her mouth with excrement. And it was her mother. Her mother did this. And that mother could sleep, hearing that poor child's groans. Can you understand, Alyosha, why a little creature who can't even understand what's done to her should beat her little aching heart with her tiny fist in the dark and the cold and weep her meek, unresentful tears to dear, kind God to protect her? Do you understand that, friend and brother? You pious and humble novice. Do you understand why this infamy must be and is permitted? Without it, I'm told, man could not have existed on the earth, for he could not have known good and evil. Why should he know that diabolical good when evil costs so much? Well, the whole world of knowledge is not worth that child's prayer to dear, kind God, Alyosha, I say. Nothing of the sufferings of grown-up people. They have eaten the apple, damn them, and the devil take them all. But these little ones, Alyosha, I'm making you suffer, Alyosha. You're not yourself. I'll leave you off if you like. And Alyosha responds, never mind. I want to suffer too. First question to our panel. And let me ask you in turn. I'll start with Matthew. Matthew, if you were creating this world, or a world, knowing that your creation would be filled with such absurd evil and unbelievable suffering, would you or could you have created that world on the tears of this little child?
No pressure.
Well, yeah, I had to ask for a one-word answer, but I have a purpose in doing that because the rest of the panel discussion is going to be fulfillment of that one statement. Would you have done it? If you'd known, could you have done it? Just as you are, a man, a human being.
If I had known previous of the child's conditions,
Yeah.
no.
Dr. Rob?
No.
Dr. Rob?
I'm a jerk. Yes.
Well, now I'll see where we're headed here. Yes, there's one in every crowd. You're exactly right. As we go on, these gentlemen are going to have an opportunity to explain themselves and their answer to that one question to Dostoevsky's problem between Ivan and Alyosha. First question is fairly easy. John Calvin and some others like him have said, it's only fair that a just and righteous God would punish all people for all time because of the sins of one woman and one man. But then is this not punishing a child for the sins of the father and mother, which is something Jesus expressly denied? What do you say to these people? We'll come right on down and get the middleman. We'll get Rob Musick for this. Is Calvin right here that in saying it's fair that God would do this? He has a right to do this. He should kill us all, but he doesn't. He chooses to save some. Others are damned. Yes, they are, but that's just the way it is. Is God right in doing that?
My response to Brother John Calvin would be this. I love you, John. I have no interest in your God. I think that God's a monster.
So, are you saying then that Calvin was in error?
Absolutely.
I'm not going to ask you, well, perhaps I will. Why do you say that?
I think that in the face of the scenario you created and the scenario of radical, profound evil that is enacted on people, right, like you created, the idea that that would be God's punishment, to me that sounds like human punishment. And when I look to the divine, I'm looking for the holy other. Calvin seems to have created just a greater, more powerful monster. I don't need a monster. I need a savior. That would be my response.
Yes, and so we're saying here that you're saying then that Calvin was incorrect when he said God had a right to do this. So then you must then believe that God did not have a right to do that. And if you believe that God did not have a right to do that, then that means God would be appealing to a moral right and wrong that is above God to know what was right to do before he did it. That would mean that God is not God, but that level of moral right and wrong that's above God is God, because God had to appeal to that before he could say what he said.
Just say pass, Rob. Just say pass.
Well, lest anyone in the audience think I'm picking on Rob Musick, what about you?
Oh, I'm ready for this one. So I'm a philosopher by training besides being a priest. And so when you're a philosopher, I know we didn't get into the nitty-gritty of, the propositions and the actual argument. But when you're a philosopher, there are a couple ways of trying to say you disagree with something. One of them is to say that a position in an argument is false. So if you say, the sky is green, I will say, false. That is just not true. Another way to get around a problem is to point out a logical fallacy. So if I say, the sky is green, and I'm happy today, therefore I have cheddar cheese on my hamburger. It doesn't work that way. None of those positions produce the answer. And the third way out is to find a word that you don't know if you agree with the way it's being used, right? Is to say, what do you mean by that word? Do we mean the same thing? Because if we don't, that can produce a very different answer. So when Calvin says that God punishes us, I want to call him out on that word. What do you mean by punish? Do you mean an active sort of punishing, like when my cat gets up in my cereal in the morning and got a sprayer with a spray bottle to get her out? No, I don't think God is actively punishing. But I do think that sin has produced evil. So I wish I had a whiteboard. I could be like Sheldon Cooper on The Big Bang Theory.
You're up here alone, brother.
I know. I got to use my words.
Yeah.
But the way I see it and the way Catholics see it is that God created man and woman in goodness. We were created without sin. We were created with the divine image fully intact in us. And by sinning, it isn't an artificial thing where God says, no, y'all got to die. It's over. Sorry. Dead. No. When we cut ourselves off from God, we cut ourselves off from life, right? When we cut ourselves off from God, we cut ourselves off from goodness. So the human race, as it is now, is cut off from God. Original sin, by the way, is the one dogma of the Catholic Church that I don't feel like I have to defend. And why do I say that? All you got to do is open up your news feed and read about all the bad stuff that people do, and it kind of sounds like we're born this way. Even my favorite response is, what about a little baby? Man, have you ever had a baby? They are selfish, mean little creatures sometimes, right? But because the human race is cut off from God in this situation where we are not perfect, we are not good, that's necessarily separating us from life. And this is what we mean when we say the wages of sin is death. It's not that God has a punishment he has to enact on us. It's God is respecting our choice. The human race chose to be here, and this is our situation where, yeah, we are cut off from life. And so in a sense, it's a punishment, but maybe not a punishment in the way Calvin means it, where it's a judge handing out a guilty verdict, as much as it's, if I smoke a lot, I'm going to get cancer.
Matthew, considering that Calvin felt that hell was a just punishment for sinners, what response do you have to this question? Was Calvin right or wrong? And if he was wrong, we've heard what Father Rob said. Do you agree with him, or?
Well, there's a middle ground between what was said by Father. Father said, I think there's a connection, obviously, between Calvin and Augustine, which seems like a lot of what I heard was Augustine with some of those views that he mentioned, which I 100% support and agree with as far as how he views the nature, the free will choice. We stepped into this initially on our own, so therefore sin is a curse upon humans. You can look and I have children, so I know exactly what you're talking about with babies, and specifically my 3-year-old. But she's the roughest one. But anyway, I also have to agree with Rob that I would agree with him on Calvin's theology. I think we both fall outside of the Calvinist vein. He definitely does, based on what he's. But I do as well. So I think that honestly, if we looked at this, we would probably be in more agreement. I think this has nothing to do with the hell question. I'm kind of backing up just a little bit to say that there's some kind of divide, because we know a lot of Reformed theology stems from Augustine. But I think that Augustine's initial view, which a lot of people really don't like for natural reasons because they feel like it lets God off the hook, that's where I am. And I believe that's where I understood you to be. Now, the question about hell, is Calvin right in saying that sinners should be damned to hell? Is that the way that you asked the question?
And I should make a proviso to that sinners should be damned to hell because they were damned to hell before they were born.
Well, that's a Calvinist position. No, I don't agree with that.
Okay.
No, no, I don't agree with that.
Okay.
I believe it's a choice. Which opens up a whole nother, if you're getting into Calvinism, a whole nother, we
talked about Augustine. If Augustine was right, he said there was no such thing as evil. He said evil is merely an absence of light.
Right.
Now, I think I know where you're going to come from the standpoint of Methodism. And again, Rob, Musick is going to come from that same history, so I think I probably know how you're going to respond. What I don't know is how Father Rob's going to respond. In fact, after his response, I don't know how Rob's going to respond on anything, I'll be honest with you. But this goes to the
So is it Rob and Rob?
it's Rob and Rob.
Oh, okay, that's
yeah,
easy. Okay.
you know,
Father Rob and Father. I have a dad, so I guess Dad Rob, Father Rob.
Okay, Dad, Father, okay.
well, I can't just say Rob, that's for sure. But so Augustine said, people are damned before they were born. They were born, as Father Rob said, born as sinners. The inherited sin of Adam and Eve, which in itself raises an issue, raises a question: do people start out on a fair playing field here? Because where I'm headed with this is, if Augustine is right, and if there is no such thing as evil, only an absence of God, a privation of light, then where there is no light, where there is no light, is there even an opportunity for a human being to choose anything else except the only thing they know, which is darkness?
God is light, and God is in this world. So there is always an opportunity to choose. How a person comes about that choice based on geography and based on cultural upbringing and a number of different things looks different. But yeah, I would suggest that there's always a choice. Otherwise, if there's not a choice, you're leaning back toward determinism.
So, and I expected you to say that. I expect Rob was going to agree with that.
I guess I question the idea of, and please don't throw me off the heretic bus. Yeah. I question the idea.
I'll do that for you.
Thank you. Afterwards, I really question the idea of people inherently being sinful in this regard. I think we're all born with the capacity. It's the system that we all choose to participate in. And I'm not comfortable with saying that baby that's born is a sinner. I'm not comfortable with that language. But when the child can make choice, practically we see all people choosing sin. In the broken world, in the system that we live in, just kind of like the economic systems kind of control our behavior oftentimes. So the idea that child has no light and is an utter darkness and this kind of profoundly sinner, hellbound kind of thing, I can't get behind any of that. I think there's a lot more hope for human nature. And I don't want to be, kind of making Augustine the straw man of the argument, but I think that there is more light within the human person than maybe this scenario is creating.
Rob, and I would have expected you to come from that exact position, having Wesleyan training. Rob, if Adam and Eve sinned, then one can say, and they were created with the possibility of not sinning or sinning, and they chose sin. One could reasonably say, and your other Rob here has run into problems with the idea of babies being born with sin. You could rightfully say that Adam and Eve, then, if they're going to choose that, if they understand the ramifications of it, they understand the ins and outs of it, they choose that of their own free will, then okay, they deserve that. But is that sin then any way transferable to the innocence of children that are born after that? Islam believes, and Islam would teach, that babies are born pure, without sin, and then they either choose to sin or choose to move toward Allah at some point in time. Does that not seem to be the more fair way of doing things here? Is God not culpable here of condemning someone before they have an opportunity to do anything?
Good question. Very good question.
Thank you.
And I feel like a snake here, but I don't mean to be.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, you got to define your terms. So when I
What term do you need me to define?
Well, I'm explaining how I would define
Okay.
the answer here. So
Okay.
when I hear the word damned, once again, we're talking like punish. Do we mean that someone is actively condemned, or is it more about the idea that heaven isn't a right? Right? That God created us for something, but salvation isn't necessarily a right. It's not something we can claim as something God has to do. It's something he does because he is good, but it's not something he has to do. So because of the human race being cut off from life, damnation just means being cut off from God, right? It's not that someone is condemned by virtue of an act, but that's just how it is. If you throw me off a building, I'm going to fall because that's how nature works, right? And what the whole Augustinian system is because that's how things work, God chose to intervene and flip it on its head. But also to respond to your thing about babies being born and sinfulness, I know that's tough and I feel that myself. The one thing that kind of keeps me where I am intellectually is the nature of how we are as a human race. You know, our sins affect each other. That's not something that should be mysterious and weird. I'm a Catholic priest, and every time there's any story about a priest abusing children or something, guess what? I'm on target when I go to Food City too, even though I've never done that. You know, there's something about our sins affect each other. If you have an alcoholic or someone who's addicted to drugs in your family, their sins affect you. And I'm not necessarily saying that in terms of like active guilt, like you're not the one on drugs, you're not the one abusing children, but that sin has ramifications. It has waves that ripple out and affect us. And while people born into this world are not guilty of the sin of Adam and Eve, they do feel its consequences. You know, in a lot of ways, the whole human race is a giant family affected by somebody's addiction to their own power. And I think that's more what I'm trying to say. And I do think that's fair.
Well, are you then?
Agreed.
Am I understanding you correctly in saying that, and we'll use your analogy of drug abuse and its effect on families? Are you then saying that and equating that with the idea that we're talking about here of the innocence of children and the ramifications of sin in the world? Are you then saying that those who are innocent that it pleases God that they are at risk here?
No, I am not saying that. In fact, Scripture would say the opposite. In Titus, the letter to Titus, Paul says, God wills that all men be saved. And in fact, this is why, at least for Catholics, that's why we've sent our people over to China and Japan and gotten people killed and into the bush in Africa. Or why, up until just recently, every Catholic mother or person who worked in a Catholic hospital had to know how to baptize a baby. It didn't matter if you were an atheist, a Muslim, or whatever. If you worked in a Catholic hospital, you needed to know how to baptize a baby, just because the idea is God is trying to make this possible. But what's neat about, as you know, that can seem unfair, but there's a flip side where it means that we get to have a role in this. You know, that if I have kids, it's my job to make sure those kids are brought into contact with salvation, right? That it's not automatic, that I have a duty as a parent and as a human being, both to kind of get them where they need to be. Just like if my child was born with a heart problem, I would have an obligation to get that child taken care of or get it help. In the same way, where our children are born without God's grace, it's our job to plug them in as best we can.
Rob in the middle Rob, we've been talking about the nature of sin, the etiology of sin, how it affects people, those who we would say are innocent or not innocent, and the response of those, as Matthew said a moment ago, the free will response to, as Father Rob said, to the will of God that all people should be saved. We're talking about those kinds of things. When God created everything, did he not know ahead of time that if he created this world as he created it, that this would necessarily be the kind of world he would get. Did he not know that?
That's a really light question.
The point being, if God is all good,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a question with a lead-in question.
Yeah, of course.
If God is all good, and God is creating a world, and it's filled with these kinds of things we're talking about, yes, people have maybe an opportunity to do something about it, to according to the will of God, to be saved and not to be lost, those kinds of things, yes. But yet the world is filled with evil, filled with suffering. Is this the best God could do?
Father Rob kind of laid a foundation for us. I'll lay my own foundation. Oftentimes and I know that maybe I should be arguing from Scripture, but oftentimes I argue from my own experience because that's kind of what I understand. And I think about my role as dad or my role as chaplain, right? And if I knew that I were going to lead my students, let's say, in a trip where they were going to be horribly hurt, right? Let's all go to, XYZ country, and 9 of you are going to be slaughtered, and 2 of us are going to survive. Am I going to go on that trip? Absolutely not. I would not do that. And I happen to believe that in God's connection with humanity and all of cosmos, that we are co-creating the future together with God. I know there's a really slippery slope, but I can't imagine if my human heart wouldn't take people down a road of suffering, how much more God, right? God's got to be better than me, or there's no God at all. So that's kind of where I'm thinking. And I know that means like, oh my gosh, Rob Musick just said God doesn't know the future. I think that God and us together are making the future. That's kind of my thinking.
Automatically you know this places you in a category called open theology with John Hick and others who see the very same thing that you're talking about. And we're going to come back to that later on in our question. But Matthew, I have to go to the same question with you. It just incredulous to me that if we say God is all good and all powerful and all knowing, that God would then say, this is the best I can do here.
I don't think it's looked at that way at all. And I mean, I think it's easy to perceive it that way. And this is really what kept me away. And I know for some of you in here that are just in here because you have to be, that this is the biggest reason that you don't attach yourself to Christianity or another religion. And maybe you have a superficial belief in I shouldn't call it superficial, I should give you more respect than that, in a God, a higher being, an energy, a power, whatever you want to call it. But the question that people ask me all the time, dealing with what we today always call unchurched people, just people in the community that I talk to, or even sometimes in class, is that how does a good God allow, I even have Christians ask me this, people in my church, how is it that a good God allows suffering and all of the pain in the world when we see all of these horrible things happen? I don't know how many times small children have been mentioned since we started talking, beginning with Dostoevsky and other things that we've talked about. But again, I go back to Augustine, and for me, whenever I was younger, it was a cop-out. It didn't feel like a good enough argument because I felt like it kind of let God off the hook. But my viewpoint with this, if I'm laying a foundation, is that God is all good. And if you understand the attributes of God through the entire Bible, but specifically in the Torah, specifically in the entire Old Testament, you see attributes of God, His character, over and over and over. But my belief is that He did create human beings with free will. There was divine foreknowledge, there was providence so I am rejecting open theism with that there would be the knowledge that was there, but that Eve, as we're told, what does it say before she chose? She freely chose. And God knew that was going to happen, but He knew that this curse was upon humans before it ever happened. So am I letting God off the hook to some degree to say that we are responsible for the world that we live in because of sin? I guess I am, but that's what my theology is built upon.
Would you go as far as Leibniz went to say this is the best world God could create?
No,
Of
this
all
is
the
not the best.
possibilities he had,
But how do
this
we have
one's
an
the best.
understanding? How do we have any understanding of good? And this is another philosophical. How do we have any understanding of what's good or what's righteous or what's pure or what's grace or what's mercy if we have no understanding of the opposite? It's just it's kind of a Marxist utopia in which everything is perfect, everything is good. I think that looks different for some people. It looks like hedonism, and you can just pursue pleasure to the utmost degree as much as you want to. For other people, it's altruism, and we just constantly do good for others. But how do we recognize anything different? How do we make any categories like good or bad or good or evil if we have no idea what this other looks like? So I'm not saying it was necessarily created or had to be created, but it is just a byproduct of what we are, the choices that we made, the choices that our ancestors, I should say, made, our original ancestors.
You mentioned something early on in your answer that that brought to mind a statement that I hear a lot of people make all the time. When they're confronted with the problem of theodicy, the problem of evil in the world, the suffering in the world, and many people will say something like, well, we're just not supposed to understand these things. These are mysteries of God.
Isaiah.
And humans are just...
Your ways are not my ways.
Yeah, that's right. So we can't speak to this. We just have to go by faith and trust God. How do you feel about that answer, that response?
Well, for me, and I'm not Catholic, but where I do love Catholicism and also Orthodox theology is this whole concept of the mystery of God. To me, there are some things that we cannot know, and the Christian life is a lot like an onion that you are constantly experiencing layer after layer after layer as you grow deeper into sanctification. And there are things that I really questioned and had issues with at 25 that I don't at 38, but it's not because I feel like I've gained an even wisdom or life experience or intelligence. It's just that volume has been peeled back a little bit further as a result of following Jesus. There are things that I never would have accepted when I was the age of a lot of you. How does evolution and creation match up? All these scientific, to me, that question is completely irrelevant to the question of creation and the importance of creation today. It's not even an important question when you look at the beauty of creation. That's another topic. But I think that you are just, what was the question? What was the question?
Just the standard question you hear from a lot of people is we're not meant to understand.
Yeah. You know, one thing I don't understand, this is really difficult for me because I hear people all the time, this happened, that happened, God would never allow this. But what I've recognized is maybe this is just a real change in our culture and a real change in the way that we look at things, because a lot more people believe in God than the devil. And I believe it was Charles Baudelaire, the poet, that said the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist. It's like people are always like, God would never allow this, God would never allow that, but they never give any credit to the enemy whatsoever when it comes to the bad things that actually happen in this world as a result of sin.
And can I follow up with that? I think some of it has to do with us in the church world and the advertisement of the way we sell Jesus. And I use that language intentionally. It's like, come to Jesus, your life will be better, you'll jump higher, you'll lose weight, your GPA will go up, everything will be great, And we close every church service by God protect us, amen. This is kind of thing. As opposed to really wrestling with that difficulty, and as you talk about, this holy mystery of faith. But I think that any person who is wrestling with that, oftentimes it's coming from their own trauma, tragedy, or experience. And I'm never going to ask someone to sit in holy mystery if that's not comfortable for them. I mean, I think about patients in hospitals. They want to research and research and research to know about their disease and know about progressions and all that kind of stuff. None of that stuff helps me, but if it helps you, pursue it. And I don't want to ask someone to sit in holy mystery if that doesn't make sense for you. If you want to know it, press in as hard as you can. I think this question, you will press hard enough at some point, you exhaust yourself, and then you kind of settle with something. But I think for all of us, we have to press, if that's your personality, press as hard as you can to try to figure it out.
We've been talking primarily about Augustine, and he did set the tone for all of Catholic theology and a lot of Protestant theology as well. Aquinas in taking that Augustinian theology and developing it to where it's still basic Catholic theology. But there's another dog in the fight. There was Augustine, a giant of the church, a giant in anybody's mind. But there's another alternative here, and I'd like to know how each of you feel about this, because it's an Irenaean theodicy, and a theology as well. Irenaeus was a church father very early on in the history of Christianity. And Irenaeus, even before Augustine, Irenaeus came up with a different viewpoint here on the sinfulness of humanity, on exactly what we've been talking about, on the culpability of God, the vindication of God in a world that seems like it's godless, all these things. Irenaeus sort of explains it differently. And his explanation is taken up by a lot of open theologians, but there are other people as well, John Hick in particular, who hangs his hat on this. He says this: the difference that we're talking about here is in an Augustinian theology, Adam and Eve were created perfect and then sinned, then fell. And then something had to be done. In an Irenaean theology, and again, Irenaeus is speaking about 100 years after Jesus. So he's Augustine, not so much, about 3 centuries. So we're then looking at this possibility. Irenaeus said, here's the way it really is. Here's the way it is. He said, God created human beings not as perfect, but as with potential. Just as Aristotle would say, they were actualizing their potentiality. So this is an Aristotelian way of looking at things, that everything in nature is on a trajectory. Babies are first a combination of sperm and egg and a zygote, a blastocyst. They develop into a fetus. They develop then, and it goes. Then as they're born, they develop into a baby, then a small child. So if you look at nature, grass grows up, it grows that high, and then it grows that high, and it grows that high. And so everything, Aristotle said, everything seems to be on a continuum of growth, of becoming. This idea of that, and what brought this to me was Rob's idea that he was talking about just a moment ago, that this idea of becoming, that we are helping shape our world, that we are helping shape our own response to that world, and that God has so created us that we are not simply pawns in the game, but that we are given the privilege of being the shapers of our own lives. Now, what Irenaeus said is taking that idea and applying it to the Eden situation. Irenaeus said what God did was not create Adam and Eve perfect, create them in the image of God, the imago Dei, create them in the image of God, but not in the likeness of God. That's a separate thing that comes later. The likeness of God is holiness. The image of God is something else that has to do with reason. So Irenaeus says, here's what happens, is that God creates Adam and Eve, and he creates them in the image of God. They have reason, they have the ability to make decisions. They have either wisdom or foolishness. They have all these kinds of things. And then he, because of God's great love for them and great confidence in them as human beings, his creation, God then allows them to make their own way by their own decisions that they make, to move forward in growth, to become all that you mentioned a moment ago, sanctification. This is this sanctification personified, sanctification writ large. That Adam and Eve started their sanctification at creation, and then it was a continual process of sanctification. Now, as a Wesleyan, you know that you can move forward towards sanctification, and then you can move backward. Then you can move forward and backward. And the first sin in Eden, Irenaeus said, was that moving backward. But it was followed by other moves forward, other moves backward, and the continuum goes on, that we are continuing to shape ourselves, to form ourselves, and to become what God wants us to become, and we'll only become that, as Wesley said, through glorifying grace. We'll only become that at death or in heaven. Now, what do you say about that? That's a contrary position to Augustine.
Well, what was his basis for this whole image of God and likeness of God? I understand the difference, one being certain faculties like reason, and then the other being like a sanctification process. I don't know that I recognize or completely I understand the difference, but I guess I'm not completely following.
Well, it may go back to what Father Rob was talking about earlier, definition of terms. And obviously, we're separated by 1,800 years from Irenaeus. And so I can't stand here and he never completely spells it out, as far as I have read, as far as I understand. Do all of you know that he ever spells it out?
He never, so Irenaeus never really gets into the nitty-gritty of how this is supposed to work. And it's important to remember that as an early Christian, an early bishop, we know Irenaeus was a disciple of John, the John who wrote the gospel. He's writing sermons, so it's important to remember the genre we're talking about. Irenaeus is not writing philosophy or even theology. He's given this in his church on Sunday morning, right? So just like in any of your sermons, you're not going to get up there and say, all right, we're going to talk about essence today, guys. You ready? Essence. That's really not what he has in mind. So I think we have to do the best we can to give him a strong argument, but you probably won't find that definition in Irenaeus himself.
That's why it was hard, much like Wesley, I guess, if most of what his work's based on sermons. But I think with Wesley, and maybe it's because he's much later, we can articulate a little, we can build a practical theology around it. So I guess I'm still going to be in the Augustine camp because I understand it better. And it seems clearer to me. I can follow A to B to C a little bit clearer than I think I can. So I think I can't. I've not studied it enough to make when you're talking about something as serious as theodicy or evil and suffering, to make a real strong assessment about it.
Well, basically, and then we're going to move to something else. Basically, Irenaeus' position was that the reason there's sin in the world, it's not because God doesn't love us, not because he's not all-powerful. It's because he's raising us up like we raise children. And sometimes we let children do this, knowing that it's going to bring that. Sometimes we don't get there in time. Sometimes other things happen. But those children are always growing, always maturing, always becoming what I want them to be when they grow up. And that is then whatever you want them to be. In God's case, it would be holy or sanctified or glorified.
That reminds me of the language that you used, Rob, with cooperating over time, kind of that synergism. I would use a little bit tamer of a word. I would use participating, like we're able to participate. I feel like cooperate, to me, almost puts us on the same exact, and I see where you're going with that, but I would say God gives us the freedom to participate. And again, I'm not even trying to take away from the sovereignty of God, but I think that we're participants in his work, and that's a great privilege that we have with free will. And I understand what you're saying. You can go forward, you can go backwards, but it just seems to me that Augustine has a stronger position.
Can I just follow up with that? I mean, for the whole thing, the idea that created everything was perfect, I really struggle with that. I think created in goodness, that's the language of Genesis 1, all things were good. I don't hear all things were perfect. And for me, that's a fundamental, we misstep the first time, because we think that the standard was this, and everything from that point on is either trying to go backwards or some kind of invisible future. And for me, it's an unfolding over time of the depth of goodness, right? We are ever discovering, working in, cooperating, creating goodness with God as new situations come up. Behold, the internet, right? How do we do good with the internet? You know, all these things are happening now. So it's just kind of this beautiful coming out, as opposed to back here was the good thing and we all jacked it up. You know, so that's kind of how I see all that play out. Go ahead, Father.
I want to jump myself in here. So I want to say I disagree with Irenaeus, not necessarily saying he's wrong. I don't think this is a good way to explain evil, though. And the problem is, if he wants to go back to Aristotle, Aristotle says there's two things that something can be in the world. It can be becoming, which is what you said. It's where it's got a power and it's being actualized. Right, or being. It can just be the thing. I think Irenaeus' problem is he might explain becoming. He doesn't explain what stuff is, though, right? So even with his thing about a child, if you have a child and the child falls and they scrape their knee and they cry and it's sad, okay, whatever, they'll be okay. But if my child is sticking a fork in the outlet, they're not going to be okay at the end of that. I promise, right? That there are some instances where being, the fact that this act will kill you, is it needs to be accounted for. So I think that some of the problem with this is to say that, it's just the drama of history is playing out and humans are learning and they're getting better. I haven't seen that that's how history played out. Looked like for a while with history, we built up to like the Roman Empire. Everything was awesome. You had flushing toilets and wine all the way across Europe. And then all of a sudden, we're back to barbarism, right? Dark ages for 500 years. And then we're building back up and everything's great. And then guess what? World War I, we're going to kill a third of the male population of Europe. And then we're going to drop a bomb on Japan that could destroy the whole world. Yeah, it just doesn't look like humanity is getting better. And what I think,
if we go back further, it looks a lot like the history of Israel as well.
Sure.
But aren't these things simply typical of what Irenaeus was saying? And he said it's just two steps forward, one back. It's forward and then back. But we need to go on to another. We need to go on to another point because we're rapidly running out of time, and we have other things that we need to. Let's consider. Let's just wipe all this slate clean. Let's get rid of Augustine. Let's get rid of Irenaeus. Let's start talking about Plato. The first person to discuss to describe what we call the principle of plenitude, or the great chain of being. Here's what he said. See if this makes sense to you. That when God created the world, the cosmos, all that is, that he must have created all possible things. Because if something was possible and was not a part of that creation, then there would have been a hole there. And that creation then would not be as perfect as it would when you're considering the whole. Then in order for there to be, then when God created the world, that this idea of suffering, of innocence, these kinds of things, that there's a great chain of being that starts out with the lowest and ends up with the greatest. God being the greatest and the depths of sin being the lowest. And there has to be every step along the way between those things. Now this was taken up, and this argument was taken up by others along the way. One of them, which was Augustine, but the primary person was Plotinus, and Neoplatonists that took up this argument and put it forward. But they explained evil as a necessary element. It's a necessary element. It's a have-to-be element in an aesthetically perfect universe. Matt, what do you say about that?
That's what I said earlier. I said you don't understand. I wouldn't say it exactly the way a Neoplatonist would say it, but I said earlier that we have no real understanding of what good is, of what righteousness is. How can we even talk about the attributes of God, if your pastor or your priest uses words like loving or kind or omniscient or omnipresent or holy or whatever it might be. If we don't have an opposite, we really have no understanding of what these terms mean.
Let me go back and pick one, and thank you for that. Let me go back and pick up one thing that we passed over as we were talking about other things that came to our mind. And one is the nature of evil itself. What do we mean when we talk about evil? And the simplest place to start, and this is where we'll start and where we'll end with this because we don't have time to flesh all this out. But is there a thing, an existing thing, that might be identified as evil, or is, as some have said, is evil not a thing? It's just an absence of good. Rob Musick, what do you think about that?
I don't think evil is a creation of itself. I think it's the absence of the good. I think it's the distortion of the good. Because based on the premise, all things were created good, and therefore then there's been a deviation from it.
Yeah, and that deviation started in Eden and has continued. Rob, what do you think?
Stop the press. I'm going to agree with Rob Musick here. But no, I think it's important to note that when we say evil's a lack, we're not saying it doesn't exist. So evil would be kind of like there's no such thing as being hungry, right? Hungry, if you open up your stomach, you're not going to find hungry in there, right? Hungry is a lack of food. It's missing food. It's where food should be and isn't, right? It's still something whose effects we can feel, but it doesn't mean that it's not real. It's a lack. So when we say that there's evil in the world, yeah, it means that there's something missing that should be there. You know, that being hateful to someone is where there should be love. Children going hungry is where children should be fed. That's what we mean when we say there's evil in the world. So,
but aren't we saying then that if evil is a manifestation, suffering is a manifestation of an evil, something that is real, something that should be there and is not there, doesn't the very fact that it should be there and yet it is not mean that it doesn't exist, but it should?
So once again, we're back to how we understand what the fall is. So what I was saying before about how when Adam and Eve sinned, when humanity sinned, however you want to understand that, not only were we cut off from God, but the Bible seems to think that we were cut off from nature, that nature fell with us, that the world itself has to feel the effects of our sin. And in a lot of ways, it makes men and women the priests and priestesses of creation, that when we do bad stuff, citation, all of the bad environment stuff, we harm creation too. I don't just mean that as a Greenpeace hippie, but there's some facts to that. So in a lot of ways, the fact that there's evil in nature, like cancer, that has to do with the fact of sin that creation shares in our fall.
And this will be the final question that we will have time to deal with, because we're going to have to give some time for audience questions, and also each of these people are going to have to share their own theodicy. But as quickly as we can, perhaps we might ought to look at this, even though we're short on time. And I've got two questions that go together. This is the way I phrase the question. Some might say God's foreknowledge, because a lot of people are bothered by the idea that God knew that a baby would die tomorrow and didn't do anything about it. Some might say that God's foreknowledge is not foreknowledge at all, but timeless knowledge gained from God's perspective of being outside of time, therefore not bound by the strictures of time-space that would define knowledge before or after the fact. But if it can be said then that this is exactly what happens with God, then how can we say God, who is outside of time, not previous is the wrong word, but that things like time and space have no meaning for God because he is some way outside them? How do we then say that God hears and answers the prayers who are inside of time? Here we've got something that's outside of time cavorting with something that's inside of time, and there's a barrier there. How, Matthew, how can that be?
I think that's a impossible question to answer for starters, but also I think it falls into the category of the mystery. You can always cop out with the mystery of God, but I think that it does. And you know, one thing that I think that we've done, I hate that time is running out. Now I sound like a politician because I'm avoiding your question, but we've not talked about some of the natural evils in this world. And I think that based on sometimes our political persuasions, as well as just some things that we see that are obvious, the fact that a child dies of hunger every 10 seconds, these are the things I think that we really need to talk about because they deeply concern us. And one thing that you said, Father Rob, earlier, when I believe it was you were talking about sin and how it affects other things, kind of like a ripple effect. In this area, we talk a lot about individual sin, like, okay, Matt's a sinner. If Matt doesn't make things right, he would go to hell. If he makes things right, he would go to heaven. He needs to focus on his personal relationship. But one thing that we don't focus a lot on in the Bible Belt is corporate sin and systematic sin. And I just wanted to point out, because I knew we didn't have much time, that a lot of times whenever we think about evil, we put it on a really individual level. But whenever we look at problems like poverty, when we look at problems like hunger, when we look at problems like racism, when we look at a lot of the evils in this world, they are systemic issues that we're so caught up on the individual concept, which, don't get me wrong, is very, very important, but salvation is holistic. It's so much larger than I think what we're making it. Even the story of the cross is so much larger than what we're making it. And these are the things that we have to be deeply concerned about. I didn't answer your question.
Well, I
but I
noticed
did
that,
want to mention that
but you
because
did agree
because
with-
I knew we were almost out of time, and that's because you guys are wondering that some of these issues around there's no God. How could there be a God if all this stuff's happening? Like, we could point to, if you're conservative, we could certainly look at abortion. If you're progressive, we could certainly look at children at the border in cages. There are all these different issues that we could look at that are very significant, very important issues. The bombs being dropped. These are things that we need to be talking about.
I would like to attempt to answer the question.
Okay.
I'll do the
Please
best
do.
I
I'm
can.
sorry.
I'll
I'm
do
sorry.
the best I can.
Somehow I knew that was coming.
Yeah.
No, I'm a philosopher by training. You guys are better preachers than I am.
I'm a sociologist.
You guys are better preachers than I am. But what I think's worth noting is, just because God is outside of time doesn't mean that he's not aware of it or doesn't know how to interact with it. I think that God is not, I wouldn't say that God is just so outside of time that he has no understanding, it doesn't mean anything for him, because God created this world, right? The only thing that exists is God, and he created the world. So in a sense, the world shares in divine nature by the fact that it exists. Not to say that it is God.
That's almost Hinduism.
Oh, well, there's a good Christian way of doing that,
Okay.
right? It's not to say the world is
He's
God.
worming out of it too.
No. It's to say that because something exists, there's no way anything can exist without God, right? That he created it, and so in a sense, he understands it. So I think to say that a God who's outside of time created time, that's kind of enough for me.
Well,
if you made it, I think you get it.
If it's enough for you, it's enough for me. That's all I've got to say. We've just come to the end of things, and we're going to have to really move quickly. So in 2 or 3 minutes, Matt, how do you work out the problem of theodicy?
Well, I go back to Augustine. It was the first thing that I was taught, and as I started to learn, even within sociology, that's what my academic background is. A lot of you that are in here are in here as a result of sociology classes. But even Max Weber's The Theodicy of Good Fortune, and some of the views that he has, I just think Augustine nailed it. I really do, and I think it's we can look at the first few chapters of Genesis, and I feel like it's there. So basically, just a really quick recap of that is, I do not associate evil within God or as the original factor or the original cause of evil, but he did not only create humans, but all of these other things that we've talked about. And if you've read the accounts of Genesis and Genesis 1, you know. And that because of free choice, sin came into the world through humans, which were a creation of God, and sin was then inherited by humans. And as a result, we've got a lot of issues in the world.
Dr. Musick?
I don't know where all this evil comes from. It just seems to be, and it's terrible, and God is impacted by it, to the point that God took flesh and died on the cross. God is not the unmoved mover. God was absolutely impacted by this. And my personal response to theodicy, I think, is rarely do I ever actually meet a person who kind of wants to know about the great cause. We simply say, oh my God, this really hurts. This is terrible. And it's our response to be very present. So my role and these guys' role, and they do a great job at it, visit their churches. Visit their churches, please. Prestonsburg, Pikeville, or Jenkins. But is to be present, to be radically present. And my job is to be an agent of God in this moment, to be right beside you in that ER or whatever it is. Or we're working together to try to help things going on in South Sudan. I don't know about the original cause, but I know this is terrible, and I want to work with you to try to make it better.
Father Rob?
So I feel like this is a really good question. The whole thing about God and evil, I do think it has to be answered. Because if you don't answer it in your head, if you don't have a head answer about how a good God can exist, at least the way the Bible and traditional Christianity explains him, I don't know how he can exist and there still be evil. That question does need an answer. And as a philosopher, I like to pull out my nitpicky tools and go into the arguments and find the words and say, what do you mean by that? How does that work? Does it have to work that way? That helps my head. But to Rob's point, that doesn't help other people so much. And what I find is really helpful for a lot of folks is that no matter how you try to answer the question, I think Christianity's ace in the hole here is to claim that God experienced evil, right? That God came and experienced torture, experienced death, he experienced injustice himself. And so he's not kind of out of the loop. That whatever the answer is, God has dealt with it himself in the same way that we kind of have to, and he doesn't pull his God privilege to get out of it.
We have just a few minutes for questions. If you are watching this by live stream from another college, you can email me, and I have my phone. It will come up, and I will relay your question to the panel. For those of you who are here, it's time for questions. Anybody got a question for anyone on the panel or the panel as a whole? Yes?
I actually have a comment.
Okay.
But I wanted to comment on your all's topic earlier about there's evil in the world, why it's not allowed. I believe that God allows evil in the world so that we can learn from it and better ourselves from it. I mean, 4.5 years ago, I was in a car wreck and had a traumatic brain injury from being in a coma for 2 months. And for the longest time, when I woke up from my coma, I cursed God. I hated what he'd done to me. But the more I thought about it, the more I remember it, the more good I seen come of it than bad. At the time of my wreck, I was in a real bad place. I didn't know it, but I was really selfishly driven. Now I'm going to college and I'm on my way to help people. Honestly, I feel like that's why God allowed me to be in the wreck. He's not happy that I was in the wreck, not happy that I was hurt, but he's happy that I'm on a better path now. Happy that I am back on track with his original plan.
You know, we used to call that God can hit a straight lick with a crooked stick. Any other comment or question? Yes, ma'am.
I look around at these young people, and from the benefit of being in my 85th year,
Yay.
I have to say, sometimes I think the middle-agers, tend to make God too small. I see these young people who need a God for today. They're into technology, they're into science, they're into philosophy, and all those wonderful things that are being taught here in this university. And I think, I'm sorry, but I wish you could have given them more of a God for them for today.
And I appreciate that comment. If I can just lovingly respond to that. All of us, I think, would agree, there's no better God than Jesus. And I know for me, I have to personally dive in. What you said, can you remind me of your name? Tim, thank you so much. What you just kind of showed for us, there's a classic guy named C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book on this problem, had it all figured out, and then life punched him right in the face, gave his wife this wretched cancer, and it just ripped his guts out. And he wrote a second book in response to it. First book called The Problem of Pain, second book called Grief Observed. And you know what? At the end, here's the truth. You got to wrestle with it. You got to wrestle with it. God is going to meet you. God will meet you. I don't know about a bigger God than that, ma'am. I think that God is radically big to meet us, and is always going to meet us in the face of Jesus. So keep looking at Jesus, and God gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
And also, I'd also like to point out, there's not a God for today. It's not like there was a God for yesterday and a God for 30 years ago and a God for today. Either there is God or there is nothing. And I don't know what else to offer besides that. If God is not enough,
But I think God is always enough. God with me is always enough.
Amen. Amen.
I feel that every day of my life now, and I didn't always. I've searched for God for 50 years before I found a place to stand. But I feel at this moment in my life, and for several years now, that God is with me always, and is always enough. And when we find that personal God, that God that lives within you and around you and in everything that we are and do, God is enough, always enough. I want you young people to know that.
Ma'am, thank you very much for your
Yes.
statement of faith. I'm not 85, but I'm 70, and I have learned that you look at things differently in different seasons of life. And I can appreciate, I've got solidarity with you about that. Was there another? Yes.
I have a question for the three of you. I got into a debate with a friend one time. I was on the pro-Christian side. He was on the anti-Christian, I guess you could say. And we was discussing religion. He asked me a question I really didn't know how to respond to. He said, if God is all good, I believe it's evil for him to make you blindly trust and obey everything he says and just not even question anything. So what, if you were in that argument, what would your response be? Because I really didn't know.
I mean, I don't know where it says you're not allowed to question. That doesn't sound like anything I've ever read. But I do think that there's a question here about how just it is for God to make you believe something. Yeah, I would say, yeah, it is just because of who he is. You know, if what I say is true, I have a right to say it needs to be believed. Now, the way I impose that on you, it's the how that gets to be the question. I don't get to cram it down your throat, but I do get to say, yes, you have to believe this, right? Like, you have to believe the speed limit out there is not 60 in the parking lot, right? That is a fact. You have to believe it. I think that's sort of the ground you have to take, that what we're talking here is truth and not so much just, this is my opinion and I want you to believe it because I'm mean, right?
And I think it also would be true to say that not to try to impose my will. Like, for example, if I knew right out those doors where people were going to shoot you and kill you, it would be horrible for me not to try to do whatever I could for you not to go through those doors, right? So I think that when you, and what I really appreciate about this whole dialogue today is that there is real evil. I think we're all, I hope we can, I think the danger is when we start saying that there really isn't evil. That to me is a super bad, slippery slope we get into. And so that the God who is good to try to get you to blindly follow, I think is the greatest act of all time because it's good, right? Why would you want anything else but good? I'd start questioning kind of mental health, right? We could start talking about that if you don't want good for yourself. And I mean that lovingly, right? If you're trying to harm yourself, that's not healthy. We need to work through that.
Now, Grayson, I could not hear you. Can you repeat the question?
I said if you were in a debate against someone, how would you respond if they said it's evil for God to expect you to blindly follow him without question?
It's evil to blindly follow,
Accusing him of being
accusing him of being evil to expect that. I think that's a strange question. I don't know. I did catch what you said about blindly following. I blindly follow. This is the way that I look at it, and then I'll say this very quickly, but this is my life. This is my entire life. I was talking to my wife about this with some things that we've got going on, and ma'am, this may help you with them to grab a hold of something about the tangible, practical side of this God. but coal mining for many years and still to some degree is really big in this area, but I'm not from this area. So I asked someone one time that was a coal miner, I said, whenever you're in a mine and you have your headlamp on, how far ahead of you can you see? And he said, well, about 10 to 15 feet. And I said, okay. I said, what if it's turned off? He said, pitch black. My life is lived, and I'm going to say that theirs probably is as well, with being able to see 10 to 15 feet in front of me at a time. I step out and I take that 10 to 15 feet, and he gives me another 10 to 15 feet. Because if he gives me 250 feet, I'm going to destroy everything.
Yes.
So I blindly follow every single day of my life with my finances, with the safety of my children, with my occupation, with where I might live, with how I'm going to spend my day, with how I'm going to treat the poor, with how I'm going to treat someone that will not forgive me. And blindly following is the most beautiful life that you're ever going to experience.
Let's say we end on that. I want to thank this panel for just a wonderful job. And it's an honor to stand on the podium with each of you and all of you. And I want you to know that, how much I appreciate every one of you. Let's give them a round of applause, would you?
And before we officially close, rumor has it this is your last forum, right?
Rumor has it.
Yes, rumor. 17 years?
17 years.
17 years. So I wanted to give you a gift, okay? And strategic gift from the...
I left mine in the car, sorry.
Yeah. And this is from the University of Pikeville, which we appreciate being a part of it today. Wow. And it's a gift from our optometry school, because you have given such vision to students over all these years, and to create this kind of dialogue. Hopefully you don't believe that we've answered the question yet, give you enough to kind of wrestle with, and exactly what Dr. Profitt has done over all these years, giving you some framework to ask the great questions of life so you get to fill in the blanks with your journey. Man, I really appreciate your scholarship, but your pastoral heart. What people don't realize, I followed Dr. Profitt in a church he pastored, and I thought he walked on water because people spoke so highly of him, of his loving heart. Appreciate your ministry over all these years. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate that. Thanks to University of Pikeville for the sweatshirt. Big Sandy gave me nothing. Just absolutely nothing. Less than nothing. Well, overall, thank you all for coming. You've blessed our hearts by being here today, and I think we leave better people because of it. God bless you.
Make sure you sign the sociology sheet out there if you have it.
What an honor to be here with the man who started my theological journey,
How you doing, Sid?
and the man who now has to put up with the inheritance of your sin from getting me started.
Well, how you been?